Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks for joining us today to hear about the results from the Dietary Intake in Scotland's Children's Survey. My name's Sophie Milne, and I'm the Events Manager at Food Standards Scotland. Today, we're joined by Alana MacDonald, Food Standards Scotland's Senior Public Health Nutrition Advisor, who will be providing some background to the report, and by Professor Lindsay Jaacks from the University of Edinburgh, who will be taking you through the results. Before I hand you over to our presenters today, though, I'd just like to quickly remind you of a few housekeeping rules. Since we're on Teams Live, you will not be able to unmute your microphones to ask questions. We do, however, welcome any questions and comments you may have, and you can post these into the chat, which should appear at the top of your screen. We will have time for questions at the end and hope to be able to answer as many of them as possible. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared in due course. I'm now going to hand you over to Alana MacDonald, who's going to speak about the background of the report. Thanks, Alana.
Thank you, Sophie, and welcome again, everyone. Thank you for attending. As Sophie mentioned, my name's Alana MacDonald, and I'm a Senior Public Health Nutritionist at FSS and have overseen the publication of our DISH survey as part of my role to lead our dietary monitoring programme at FSS. This is certainly a milestone moment for us. Having so many people attend the webinar to hear the results is just fantastic. So thank you all so much. I hope you enjoy it, and we'll look forward to the discussions afterwards. We'll be joined by Dr. Gillian Purdon, our Chief Nutritionist at FSS, and Jeff Ogle, our Chief Executive. It's also a milestone for us in the sense that this survey is the first time we've had detailed data on the diets of children and young people in around 15 years, with the last survey of this nature published in 2010. Data like this is so important to us and, of course, our other stakeholders in understanding what children are eating, where improvements need to be focused, as well as how things are different between age and sex groups and deprivation. And all of this is extremely important to enable us to make strong evidence-based recommendations for policies that will improve our food environment and make it easier for everyone to be able to consume a healthy and sustainable diet. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll now hand you over to Professor Lindsay Jaacks, who is a Professor of Global Health and Deputy Director of the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Systems at the University of Edinburgh, and our Principal Researcher leading the delivery of our DISH survey. So a huge thank you to Professor Jaacks and the rest of the research team for their hard work. And now over to you, Lindsay, to take us through the results.
Great, thanks, Alana. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've just tested this, so hopefully I get it right. All right, are you guys seeing my my screen there?
Yep, that's perfect, Lindsay.
Yep. Excellent. So I just want to start out before we dive into the results by acknowledging that this project was not done by one individual. It's just one person presenting today, but it was a huge team effort to get the project to where it is today. And I've mentioned those who contributed here, and many of them are also here today in the group, so will hopefully help me out with some of the really difficult questions. But a big thank you to this team. And of course, I also want to start out by thanking all the families that responded to our survey when they got that purple envelope in the mail, inviting them to participate. Without them, this project, of course, would not be possible. And so we're so grateful for all of the time that they contributed to this survey. So Alana touched on these points already, but of course, a Scotland where everyone eats well is a public health priority. But before this survey, this DISH survey, we didn't know much about what children and young people were eating in Scotland, with the last comprehensive survey happening in 2010. So this dietary intake in Scotland's children, or DISH survey as we call it, aimed to fill this gap by providing detailed information on all of the foods and beverages that children and young people between 2 and 15 years are eating right across Scotland. So to identify participants for DISH, we worked with Public Health Scotland's Electronic Data Research and Innovation Service, or called EDRIS, and the Royal Mail's postcode address file to select a random sample of eligible addresses, again, right across Scotland. And about 19,500 letters were ultimately sent, and they were sent in 2 batches. So the first batch went out in January last year, and then the second batch went out in June of those purple envelopes that I showed. Ultimately, about 9% of people who received a letter actually completed the survey. And we considered any selected participant who submitted at least one dietary recall as having completed the survey. And those were the people who we included in the results that were presented in the report and are presented in today's presentation. So we use sample weights to ensure that the results are representative of the population of children and young people living in Scotland. And so that accounts for potential differences that we might have seen in response rate by age group or sex or neighborhood deprivation. So all of the results presented today are survey weighted and therefore representative of children and young people living in Scotland. These are the demographic characteristics of survey participants. So 20% were 2 to 4 years old, 43% were 5 to 10 years old, and 37% were in the older age group of 11 to 15-year-olds. About half were female and half were male. 12% reported a minority ethnic background, and 16% were single-parent households. And these demographics are broadly similar to demographics from the latest Scottish census data. So dietary intake, which of course was the focus of this survey, was assessed using a method called a 24-hour dietary recall. For children who were in preschool or primary school, this diet survey was completed by the parent or guardian with the child's help where that was appropriate. But for children who are in secondary school, the child had the opportunity to complete the recall themselves. And in our survey, 61% of them did so. That means that 39% of secondary school children, so the remaining ones, the parent or guardian completed the survey on their behalf, again with the child's help where appropriate. The survey was self-administered online using a web platform called Intake24, which I've shown a screenshot of here, and just so you have a sense of what participants saw when they completed the survey. So the software asks you to enter all the foods and beverages that the child consumed on the previous day, including estimating the amount of the item consumed, often using images like the one that I've shown here for porridge. And then on the back end of Intake24, the foods and beverages are each linked to a database called the Nutrient Data Bank. And that database has the nutrient content of all of those foods. So for example, we know how many calories, how much fat, how much protein, iron is in 100 grams of this porridge. And that's what we use to understand what the nutrient intake of participants was. And in addition, we have matched these food items, such as porridge in this example. We've matched them to the carbon footprint of each food item. So we also know how many greenhouse gases are emitted in making this bowl of porridge that a participant might have for breakfast. These results aren't included today, but we are working on a future report. So stay tuned for that. That will include those results. So in terms of the number of recalls that participants completed, we asked them to complete up to 4 over a 2-week period. And this just shows the spread of the number of recalls that participants completed. So you can see it was almost a third of participants who completed 4 recalls. And that means that we have a better idea of their child's usual intake as compared to just having 1 recall. Which may not be a representative day. So we were really pleased to see this spread of recalls with 84% of participants completing 2 or more recalls. So moving on to the results now. The first thing that we looked at was adherence to the Scottish dietary goals. So the 11 Scottish dietary goals describe the diet that will improve and support health of the Scottish population, including children and young people. So to take just one example of those goals, free sugars should be less than 5% of energy intake. I don't have time to go through all of the goals today, but I've included a link in this presentation, and these slides will be shared with people attending this webinar so that you can click through and see the details of all of the goals. The goals were last updated in 2016, and Food Standards Scotland is currently reviewing and updating the goals to ensure that they represent current scientific evidence on food, nutrition, and health. But we use these 2016 goals. So the first results of the DISH survey in terms of adherence to the Scottish dietary goals, I'm showing those here. And what you can see from this figure, let me just get my laser pointer. What you can see from the figure is that most children are meeting the Scottish dietary goals for trans fat, total carbohydrates, total fat, and salt intake. It's important to point out that the salt that is included in DISH doesn't fully take account of salt added during cooking, and it excludes salt added at the table. So the salt intake that you see in this figure is likely to be underreported. So perhaps we should take it with a pinch of salt, but just to point that out at the start. In contrast to those four goals, the other four goals shown in this figure, fiber, energy density, saturated fat, and free sugars, fewer than 1 in 5 children and young people met these goals. And that was particularly true for free sugars, which was the Scottish dietary goal that we saw the poorest adherence to. We saw some important differences in adherence to the goals by age, and I'm showing that in this figure here. So you can see, for example, particularly for the four goals for which there's lower adherence, you can see large differences in terms of fiber, energy density, and free sugars, with young people 11 to 15 years being the least likely to achieve these goals. And you can see that the difference is quite substantial for these three Scottish dietary goals, especially when compared to younger children 2 to 4 years old. In addition to those nutrient-based goals and the energy goal, there are also 3 food-based goals, one for fruits and vegetables, one for red and red processed meat, and one for oily fish. The 2016 revised Scottish dietary goals do not set a specific portion size for these 3 goals for children and young people. And so we didn't calculate the percent achieving these goals. Rather, we just calculated the mean of those, and we compared that to the recommended portion for adults. So to take the example of fruits and vegetables, the mean intake of fruits and vegetables in the sample was 272 grams, just shy of 300 grams, which is below the recommendation for adults. Of note, most of this grams of fruit and vegetables is coming from fruit, both fresh fruit and fruit juice, and a much smaller proportion coming from fresh vegetables and beans and dried fruit. In terms of the red and red processed meat, the mean intake was 41 grams in the sample, which is well below the cut point for adults. And we did see a difference in this, with it being higher in males and young people 11 to 15 years as compared to females and younger children 2 to 4 years. And then finally, for oily fish, we found that only 16% of children and young people had at least a portion a week for that dietary goal. In terms of differences by neighborhood deprivation, there were actually very few differences in adherence to Scottish dietary goals, with the exception being the 2 that I've shown here. And what you can see here is the adherence to the fiber goal, and then mean intake of fruit and vegetables by a metric of neighborhood deprivation called SIMD, the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. And what you can see is that fiber intake and fruit and vegetable intake are significantly higher in children and young people living in the least deprived neighborhoods as compared to the most deprived neighborhoods. So moving on to the protein, vitamin, and mineral intake, we, in order to evaluate intake of these in the sample, we used what are called dietary reference values. And these provide a benchmark against which dietary intake can be assessed in order to determine if people or the population or subgroups within the population, such as adolescents, whether or not they're getting enough nutrients to cover their needs. And it's perhaps important to note out that the recommendations were set at the upper end of the range in order to err on the side of caution and minimize the risk of undernutrition. So there are two specific dietary reference values that we looked at. One is called the RNI, the reference nutrient intake, and the other is the LRNI, or lower reference nutrient intake. So the RNI is the nutrient intake that's adequate for 97.5% of the population. So it's considerably higher than what most people need. And if you're consuming that level of the nutrient, then it's very unlikely you're going to be deficient in the nutrient. The LRNI, on the other hand, is the amount adequate for 2.5% of the population. So most people will actually need to consume more than that value. And if you're habitually consuming less than it, then you're likely to become deficient in that nutrient. So we looked at both of these in the sample. So when we compared it to the RNI, the reference nutrient intake, we found that the population mean intake in our dish sample and in subgroups, so by sex, by age group, and SIMD, was above that cut point, meaning sufficient intake for protein, vitamin A, riboflavin, vitamin B12, and vitamin C. For folate, it was above the RNI for all groups except for females aged 11 to 15 years, among whom it was slightly below the RNI. Then moving on to the minerals, we saw a similar pattern here as we did for folate. So for all of these minerals, the population mean intake was above the RNI for all groups except for females, and in some instances also males 11 to 15 years old. So quite consistent with what I showed for the adherence to Scottish dietary goals. We tended to find poorer diets among 11 to 15-year-old young people. And you can see that when you look at the percent of the population of these subgroups in the population below that cut point, which is likely to indicate a deficiency if you habitually consume below that cut point, we find that the proportion of females 11 to 15 years old who are below that cut point is quite high for some of these nutrients. So 43% for iron, for example, 40% for magnesium, and then a third for selenium. In terms of the, I'm just going to check the time. Oh yeah, I've got plenty of time. In terms of, so we also looked at the major food groups that were contributing to key nutrients. And I've highlighted here the three that I highlighted on the previous slide as being of particular importance for females 11 to 15 years who had a higher percentage of being below the sufficient cut point, the LRNI. So iron, magnesium, and selenium. And you can see the proportion of those nutrients coming from different foods. So to take the example of iron, almost half of iron intake in the dish sample is coming from cereal and cereal products, particularly breakfast cereals, which are often fortified with iron. 14% was coming from meat and meat products, and then 9% from vegetables and potatoes. For magnesium, we see a similar pattern in that the top food group contributors are similar. So cereals and cereal products, again, being at the top with almost a third, and then milk and milk products, meat and meat products, vegetables and potatoes. So these were the major food group contributors. So moving on to consumption of discretionary and additional foods. This was an analysis that we did for DISH based on Scottish government consultation on proposed regulations to restrict the promotion of foods and drinks high in fat, sugar, or salt. And in that consultation, there was detail on the foods that would be potentially subject to restriction. And that list included discretionary foods and drinks, which people will be perhaps more familiar with, things like sweet biscuits, crisps, and sugary drinks. But it also included additional categories, which we've called additional foods here. And these additional foods are foods that are also captured beyond the discretionary foods by existing promotion restrictions in England, such as things like sugary breakfast cereals, sweetened yogurts, pizza, and chips. So we analyzed both of these groups to understand patterns of consumption in children and young people. So I'll walk you through the first finding, and this is focused on the first of those categories, the discretionary foods. I'll show the additional foods on the next slide. But this is basically just showing the spread of these food groups through the different colors over here in terms of their percent contribution to energy intake. And across the bottom, you can see the different demographic groups. So the first three are females of different ages, so 2 to 4 being here, 5 to 10, and 11 to 15. And then the second three are males, 2 to 4, 5 to 10, and 11 to 15. Overall, 15% of energy came from these foods, these discretionary foods, but you can see that there are some interesting patterns when you look at differences across the different age groups. So to take the example of crisps and savory snacks, which is this light green area, you can see that the proportion of energy coming from that goes up with increasing age, particularly among females. And we see a similar thing with confectionery in the darker blue, an increase with increasing age, particularly among females, but also among males. And then finally, to point out the sugar-containing soft drinks, which also significantly increased with age, again, among both males and females. There was actually a negligible proportion coming from these drinks in 2 to 4-year-olds, but that increased, and particularly substantially among 11 to 15-year-olds. I'll just point out that we didn't find very much difference in the contribution of energy to these discretionary foods by neighborhood deprivation. The biggest differences were by age. And I'll just point out before I move on to additional foods that the proportion of, I've mixed this up before. The proportion of energy from in DISH was 21%, apologies, and that is higher than what we saw in adults. So this here is for adults, 15% of energy versus DISH, which was 21% of energy. Apologies for that mistake. So moving on to additional foods, the format here is exactly the same as the previous slide. The thing that has changed is the food groups. So instead of the discretionary food groups, here we have those additional food groups. So the breakfast cereals, pizza, ready meals, roast potatoes and chips, and yogurts and dairy desserts. We saw a smaller proportion of energy coming from these foods in the DISH survey as compared to the contribution of discretionary foods on the previous slide, but still higher energy intake in children and young people from these foods than in adults. In terms of interesting differences across the demographic groups, we saw a significant decrease in the percent of energy coming from breakfast cereals, with increasing age. So 2 to 4-year-olds tended to have a greater contribution of breakfast cereals than 11 to 15-year-olds. And we saw a similar thing with yogurts and dairy desserts, with a significant decline in the contribution of yogurt and dairy desserts as children and young people age, both in females and here in males. So that was the contribution to energy. We looked at several other nutrients. I won't go through all of them for the sake of time today. The patterns do tend to be quite similar to the energy patterns, but I just wanted to highlight free sugars here because, as I mentioned, this was the Scottish dietary goal that we saw the poorest adherence to in terms of across the board for children and young people. So we were quite interested to understand where were these free sugars coming from. And the results show that 41% of free sugars are coming from discretionary foods. The groups and the color coding are the same as the previous slide. Of course, we don't see much contribution from crisps and savory snacks to the free sugars. They're largely coming from things like confectionery, sugary drinks, sweet biscuits, and cakes, sweet pastries, and puddings. But one thing that's quite striking here, again, mirroring the energy intake, if you look at the light pink here, you see this very big increase in the contribution of sugary drinks. As children and young people get older, sugary drinks become more prominent as contributors to free sugar intake. Yeah, so important to point that out. And then again, looking at free sugars by additional food groups here. Again, you don't see much from the potato category here, or very much at all from the ready meals. Most of the free sugars from these additional food groups are coming from breakfast cereals, as well as yogurts and dairy desserts. And what you can see is that overall, the contribution of these food groups to free sugars goes down quite substantially with increasing age, as breakfast cereals and yogurts in particular become, consumed less frequently. Their contribution to free sugars also goes down. So my final results slide is on food insecurity, which we also asked about as part of the DISH survey. And these 3 questions asked about food insecurity in the past 12 months. And what we found was that overall lack of money or other resources resulted in 44% of parents in the most deprived neighborhoods reporting being worried about running out of food in the past 12 months, 38% having smaller meals than usual or skipping meals, and 17% actually running out of food, reporting running out of food. And this is markedly higher than among parents in the least deprived neighborhoods, which highlights the critical need to address food insecurity for households, particularly households with children and young people living in them. So in conclusion, poor diets, the DISH survey found that poor diets continue to be a public health challenge in Scotland, particularly for young people 11 to 15 years. In general, diets are too energy dense, they're too high in salt, saturated fat, and free sugars, and then too low in fiber, fruit and vegetables, as well as oily fish. We found that protein, vitamin, and mineral intakes are generally adequate in children and young people, with a few exceptions. Zinc was slightly below the RNI. Iron was insufficient for nearly half of females aged 11 to 15 years. And then calcium, magnesium, potassium, and selenium intakes were also below the RNI for both males and females in that age group. In terms of recommendations, I've highlighted some of the key ones that we made here. So further measures needed to reduce intake of free sugars especially, as well as saturated fat and salt. And these measures should focus on the discretionary and additional foods that we highlighted as being major contributors to these nutrients, as well as meat and meat products, which were identified as important contributors, particularly to saturated fat. Measures are also needed to increase intake of fiber. Again, less than 1 in 5 actually met the Scottish dietary goal for fiber. And these could focus on important contributors to fiber in the sample, including bread, breakfast cereals, pasta, rice, vegetables, and beans, as well as fruit. And together, these changes in the first 2 points could reduce the energy density of diets, which would be beneficial for healthy weight in children and young people as well. So with that, I will stop and ask questions, or answer questions, maybe not ask any. And I'll point this out as well. The summary briefing and the full report, along with all of the annex tables, is available on the Food Standards Scotland website. We also have a 2-page infographic, and future updates will be available on our study website for DISH. So I've included that link here as well, which you can check for future updates. And I've included my email address, so welcome any questions there as well. So I will stop sharing, I think, but I can always pull my slides back up if there are questions as we go through on the panel.
That's great. Thanks so much, Lindsay. I can hear myself. Yes, so we will move on to the Q&A now. And we've had quite a lot of questions coming through, but if you are now able to if you do have some questions, please just add them to the chat and we'll start going through them. As well as there being Lindsay and Alana in the Q&A, we also have Gillian Purdon, who's our Chief Nutritionist, and Jeff Ogle, who is our Chief Executive from Food Standards Scotland. So I'm going to start at the top and kind of work my way down. I thought one of the first questions was, how did the research define free sugars? So I thought that was quite a good one to start with. Alana or Lindsay?
Yep, happy to jump in, Lindsay. So yeah, free sugars, in line with the UK definition, is defined as sugar that is added to foods and drinks that's not naturally present and occurs and alongside the sugars that are present within fruit juice and honey. So that is the definition that we use, in line with the rest of the UK as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I suppose this links in with breakfast cereals and sugar and everything. With most of the nutrients coming from breakfast cereals, mostly classified as UPFs, what is the implication for public health concerns? Alana?
I'll grab that one as well, Sophie. Yeah, I think firstly on UPF, I think it is important to realise that despite there's been quite a lot of growing interest in the topic, there are quite significant limitations in that evidence base. And so in contrast, we have really strong and robust evidence for reducing fat, sugar and salt. So for breakfast cereals, yes, they are clearly an important source of many micronutrients, but they are also contributing to things like sugar. And so what we want to see is a shift away from these more sugary options towards the lower sugar, higher fibre options. And we hope that that could be achieved through things like reformulation, through rebalancing of promotions, and just generally improving the food environment. Thanks.
Thank you. And if you do have your hand up for a question, if you're able to post it in the chat, then I will read out the questions, because I don't think you're able to unmute your microphones. Okay, so Lindsay, this would be one for you. And we'd be interested to know what proportion of the sample were below LRNI for calcium.
Yep. Yeah, it was I've stuck it in the chat so people can reference it as well. It's 4% overall, but it rose up to 10% in young people 11 to 15 years. So very similar trend to what we see with the other minerals, with an increase in the proportion dropping below that cut point in adolescence. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Question from Stephen. What are we doing to address these deficiencies? Are we considering fortification of other foodstuffs, i.e. bread, or nutritional enrichment of animal products, i.e. eggs with omega-3? Thank you. Alana?
Might leave that to Food Standards Scotland.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think I'll probably bring in Gillian Purdon as well. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that nothing's off the table in terms of improving diet. We do have to be led by the evidence base. And so, as I said before, improving the food environment really help bring us towards that. And it isn't just about taking away the fat, salt, sugar, and the calories. It's also about adding in the fruits, vegetables, fibres, and so on. I wonder, Gillian, if you might have anything else to add to that?
Happy to add a few points. I think with these additions, there's two sort of things to think about. One is that there's some mandatory additions that manufacturers have to make to certain things, like flour, for example, and you'll probably be aware that folic acid is a new addition that will be required from 2026 onwards, and there's a kind of phasing in, and that's for health reasons. So for some, there's also other things that are added, other vitamins that are added to flour. So for some there needs to be, but things like breakfast cereals, it's more voluntary, so there is a lot more difference depending on what you choose. So I think that can make it difficult. So as consumers, it's helpful to then encourage people to actually check the label and have a look. It's not always easy to know what things are fortified and what not. And I think particularly for if you do have young children, you might think, for example, I'll buy the organic option, that might be the most healthy. It's unlikely to be fortified at all. So it's just worth bearing some of these things in mind. It is very difficult and it's hard to know. We don't have any specific initiatives that mandate that. So I think that's why, unless they're required by law, which is only very few things, you really need to check the label. So look for the lower sugar, as Lana says, the lower salt options, higher fibre, but yeah, it's worth checking for fortification as well.
Great, thank you. Lindsay, do we know when the young people consuming the discretionary foods, do we know when they are consuming it? Is it during the school day when they can go to the shops rather than have packed lunch at school?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's actually one of the things we've already started working on as a next step analysis. It wasn't in this initial report, but it is something we're looking at. Ricky, who is on the call, I think, has been doing some interesting analyses in terms of number of eating occasions, for example. And what we find, I think the mean, if I'm not misremembering Ricky, is 5 or 6 occasions a day, which suggests that snacking in between the main meals of breakfast, lunch, and dinner is quite common. If you have young children, it won't be surprising to hear that. But so we're definitely interested in trying to understand this type of patterning of when these foods are consumed, as well as where the food is coming from. For example, is it from schools, convenience stores, that sort of thing. So they're next steps, but unfortunately not in the current report.
Thank you. Where do the background levels of minerals and vitamins come from? And then somebody also asked, did we ask people whether they were taking a multivitamin that could tie in?
Yeah. So I'll answer the second one quickly because we did ask that, and those results are presented in the report in terms of frequency of consumption, and we were particularly interested in looking at supplements recommended by Food Standards Scotland, for example, supplements containing vitamin D. And we found that, I'm just actually pulling up, 43% of children and young people reported taking some type of dietary supplement. And those, we kept that separate. So all of the intakes that I reported for the vitamins and minerals, those are intakes from food, not from food plus supplements. So the RNIs and the LRNIs are meant to be attainable from a healthy diet without supplements, with the exception being, of course, vitamin D in Scotland, particularly during these lovely rainy winter days. Oh, and sorry, where the nutrient data comes from. So these data come from on the back end of Intake 24 when I mentioned the example of this linkage that happens, so we know how many calories and minerals and things are in a bowl of porridge. That data is a UK-wide database, so we don't have Scotland-specific estimates. One of the reasons why that would be difficult is that many of us don't know where the food is coming from. So we may know where we purchased the food, what shop we purchased it from, but we may not actually know the country that that food was produced in or processed in. And we don't collect that information as part of a survey, this survey. It's an interesting question, but unfortunately there are quite a few data gaps in that regard right now. So the database is a UK-wide one rather than a Scotland-specific one.
Great, thank you. A question from MSP Brian Whittle. So we have an obesity epidemic, which obviously relates to calorie intake. However, are you considering linking this to calorie output and the potential long-term effect of exercise on health, including as a vehicle to promote a better diet? Alana or Gillian?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. I mean, I think exercise has lots and lots of benefits to health, and I wouldn't detract from that at all. There's lots of mental health benefits and just benefits to physical and general health. So yeah, we know that those things are really, really important. But in terms of actual, weight gain, and the biggest contributor here is what you eat. And so you can't, that sort of phrase, you can't outrun a bad diet, and that tends to play out. So whilst I think exercise does have a role in health and improvement in health, and yes, these things should be integrated together, I think we've got such a problem at the moment in terms of how poor our diet is, and unfortunately this survey does show that it's really quite a stark reality of that I think we really need to focus on how we can start to try and improve that, and how can we make it easier for people really to eat more healthily. Yes, we want people to have access to be able to go outside and be physically healthy as well as eating well, but I think that there's so much of a challenge here around what people are putting into their bodies, that we need to really look at that and try and facilitate improvements there where we can. I don't know if Alana, have you got anything else to add to that, or Lindsay, in fact?
No, I think that was perfect, Gillian.
Thanks, Sophie.
Right. Okay, so to what extent do you think dietary trends, e.g. increasing vegetarian veganism, is impacting the nutrition intake?
Do you mind if I jump in, Lindsay?
Yeah.
Perfect. I think it's a really interesting question, actually. There's a lot of different trends and fads, isn't there? And, undoubtedly do impact people. I think vegetarian and veganism is still relatively low in the population. There aren't, a huge number of people following this kind of diet. However, we do obviously need to be careful when following these types of diets. There's a good way to do it, and there's a not so good way to do it. It is worth highlighting some research that, again, Professor Jaacks and colleagues did for us, looking at the impact of reducing meat and dairy amongst adults in Scotland, and it found that it was demonstrably possible to reduce intakes of meat and dairy in line with climate change recommendations with suitable alternatives. And so I think it just highlights the importance of not just taking away, but also increasing the positive food and drink categories like fruits and veg, fibre, oily fish. And so that is a study that we wish to repeat within the children's data as well. So definitely watch this space, more evidence coming. Anything that you'd like to add, Lindsay?
Yeah, I'll just add, I agree. It's a really interesting question, and one that we're really interested in. Unfortunately, in the DISH survey, I think we have, and don't quote me on this because I'm trying to find it, but I haven't found it in my output here. I think there are only 2 or 3 participants who don't eat meat or dairy products on this 4-day recall period that we're looking at. So the sample is just too small for us to do anything with specific to that in this dish survey, because it's not as prevalent of a pattern yet in the population. But definitely watch this space, because we are working on some modeling work to try and understand what the implications of such a diet would be, and what sorts of broader dietary changes would be needed in order to support achieving the RNIs and the LRNIs that I mentioned with that type of dietary pattern.
Just kind of one thing I could add there, Sophie. It's just, I suppose it's to make the point that you can have a healthy vegetarian diet, you can have a healthy sustainable diet, but you can equally have a very unhealthy vegetarian and a very unhealthy and sustainable diet. So I think we really need to look at all of the things in totality together. So I think it's, these things do come and go, and I've been around long enough to see them come and go quite a bit. But actually, I think it's actually the most important thing is what people are eating, what's behind the trends or their beliefs or the reason behind that all will vary, and it will continue to vary. But I think we just need to focus on how we can achieve the dietary goals or progress towards those dietary goals within the parameters that you as individuals and as a population are prepared to eat within it. And you can do that whether it's vegan, vegetarian, or if it's specific religious reasons that you consume certain things. So we're here to advise right across the piece.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was an interesting question. Lindsay, did we look into hydration levels in children and where that came from?
Great question. We have data on that. We've not looked at it in this report, but it's definitely something that could be explored in the future. Yeah. We looked at intake of sugary drinks, as I mentioned, but not hydration as a whole.
Why is there no recommendation around the low mineral intakes, which were intakes, some of which were below the LRNI?
Yep. I can take that. That's more of a slide oversight in trying to jam everything into 30 minutes. The report itself does definitely talk about this, particularly for 11 to 15-year-olds and females in that age group, but males as well. For many of those minerals were falling below the RNI, and the percent below the LRNI was 15% or more for many of those nutrients. So it's definitely of concern. The fact that we also see higher consumption of the discretionary foods, I think does suggest generally a poor overall dietary pattern. And so improving the, sorry, my dog is barking at the mailman. Improving the overall dietary pattern is really required in order to address both of those things.
Great, thank you. I think it would be interesting to find out what are the next steps following this publication on the findings. Will there be further research, or that would probably be interesting to find out.
Yeah, I can start us off on that, Sophie, and actually I can also maybe mention there was a comment about underreporting just at the same time. So yes, we've obviously published the report, which is absolute milestone for us. As I said, there's a lot to digest in there, a lot of information for us to consider. We mentioned there's going to be further modelling work to look at the impact of reducing meat and dairy, and really that's just the beginning. I know that the Edinburgh team have lots of ideas on what else can be drawn out of that, and I think we'll be continuing to learn those findings for quite some time. Some other work, and it's really just because I spotted the question on it rather than being directly linked to the dish survey, is some work to look at misreporting and the difference, because as we know, it is a huge issue within dietary surveys, and it's not one that we necessarily have the answer to, or that anybody has the answer to, but it is something that we're starting to consider what the gap might be between what's reported as intake and what's being purchased. So I think it'll be really exciting to see what we come up with in the coming months. And so yes, do watch this space for more evidence on that. I think, Lindsay, was there anything to add before we let Jeff come in on that? No. Okay, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks. So I suppose what next, where next is a good question. From our perspective, we published a strategy in March 2023, I think it was. I'm losing track of years. Which kind of set out what we think needs to be done, and fundamentally it's about changing the food environment. And this report just confirms some of the reasons why we need to do that. We've had the Food Foundation's report last week on broken plate, which again confirms all the issues around dietary health. We've had the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report on levels of poverty that came out last week as well. My view is the one thing we don't need more of is more diagnosis. To quote the Prime Minister, we know what the problems are. I think we need to really start shifting to a much more deliberate action in terms of solving this. And I think that does include looking at things like mandation of free formulation. It does mean looking at, in my view, extension of things like the sugar levy. It does mean looking at things in way which we change the food environment, for example, around the planning laws. It also, I think, there is an opportunity to work more collaboratively on a four nations basis. I think we need to be looking at that. And I think the other thing that's been interesting recently, Nesta have produced some research earlier this year, which was actually looking at what changes could be made in terms of improving the food environment and reducing obesity and overweight in the UK. It's quite interesting in what it says in terms of, if you like, the biggest bang for your buck. So some of what they're suggesting, for example, is much greater transparency from retail in terms of providing information on the nutritional content and value of food, which would make a significant difference. Interestingly, I mean, some of the things about education, it's not that education should be dismissed, but in terms of impact, it doesn't have as much impact as changing the food environment and the transparency and frankly holding industry more accountable. So I think the issue for us is really just we're going to keep pushing forward. We know ministers are looking currently at the consultation on promotions and what they're going to do around that. So I think we still need to kind of keep the foot on that. And the Scottish Government are also looking at production of a public health framework as well, so which includes diet and obesity in that as well. So there's quite a few things going on. I think what we really do need to do is ensure that there's a continued push for action rather than more diagnosis. I've said this quite often. You know, obesity and overweight, I know this is about children, but obesity and overweight in adults is at 67%, 2/3 of the population. You know, at what level does it get to before we do something? 85% before we do something? You know, if not now, when, is the kind of quote I often say. So I think this is, in terms of this survey, I think it is showing a range of concerns in terms of children's dietary health. And we know if we don't get it right with children, then we're just exacerbating problems later on in life. So hopefully this will also be an incentive for governments to actually also be encouraged to take action. That's it, Soph.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I guess, well, Lindsay, is there a plan for another survey, or Alana, have we got a plan to do another survey in the future like this?
Oh, a very good question, Sophie. So I think we always consider what further surveys we might need going forward, you know, in particular population groups of interest. So it's certainly something that we would need to consider, but we are looking forward to future data, perhaps as part of the Scottish Health Survey, which will allow us to dig deeper and provide a trend and see how things have changed. But yeah, it's all a bit TBC at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so just time probably for a few more questions. Lindsay, this will be for you. Did the survey explore anything related to eating patterns / time of day, e.g. was it meals or was it versus snacking, grazing?
Yep, we definitely have that data, and it's in our plans to start looking at it. And in fact, Ricky has already started to look at this, but it was not included in this initial report. So it's something to stay tuned for future analyses of these surveys. Yeah. If there are specific questions, I think that's from Jenny, feel free to email me, and we'd be happy to receive them if there's something that would be useful for NHS or others. We're happy to receive those questions.
Mm-hmm. And Susan also asked if there was data available per board or local authority area, so that maybe she could email you and
yep, that information is available. Yep.
Yeah. Great. I think we've had quite a lot of comments just on food vendors and what kind of data about nutritional content of school meals.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's been quite a lot of comments on those rather than questions. And another one on increasing support cookery classes in schools. I mean, I think that would be great. So, well, I think actually that's kind of most of the questions we've gone through. So I think we'll round it up there, and I will have a look through questions. If there is any that we haven't answered, we'll be posting the recording on YouTube, so we'll try and add in any questions that we haven't answered underneath. We're also going to be sending out the recording. We'll be sharing Lindsay's presentation with yourself, and also the report, and we'll be sending a short questionnaire, just asking for your feedback. But yeah, thank you so much to all our presenters today. That's been brilliant, and thank you for everyone to come along, and hopefully that's been a great insight into the report and the results. So enjoy your afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Sophie.